Welcome to 1905 New Orleans, a city of unparalleled heritage.
In the early years of the 20th century, New Orleans was a city that vibrated with an energy no other could match. A crowded port where steamboats released their whistles over the Mississippi, where cultures from 3 continents mixed on cobblestone streets, and where something entirely new was emerging from the saloons, the brothels, and the public squares. In this video, I use modern AI tools to bring historic paintings, maps, and engravings to life, shifting perspectives, changing camera angles, and moving through these scenes in ways their original artists never could have imagined. The goal is not just to observe the past, but to step into it, to walk through New Orleans as it once was, and feel what it meant to be here at the exact moment jazz was being born. And if you stick around until the end, we'll compare these same locations to how they look today, to see what time has changed and what still remains. Before we step into the streets of old New Orleans, it helps to understand how this story began. The city was founded in 1718 by French colonists who chose a swampy bend of the Mississippi, a place that by all logic should never have hosted a great city. But the strategic location changed everything. For nearly 2 centuries, waves of French, Spanish, Africans, Caribbeans, Germans, and Irish arrived here, each group bringing their own culinary, musical, and religious traditions. By 1905, those layers of influence had created something unique, a city that resembled no other in America, nor any other in the world. This image shows the French Quarter, the historic heart of the city, with its wrought iron balconies and brick buildings covered in stucco painted in pastel tones. Despite its name, most of what we see here is not French architecture, but Spanish. 2 great fires in 1788 and 1794 destroyed nearly the entire original city, and the Spanish rebuilt it with strict fire codes that banned exposed wood. The ornate balconies, the interior courtyards shaded by palms and bougainvillea, the shutters painted green and blue. All of these are legacies of Spanish rule that ended over a century ago, but whose imprint remains intact. Here we see Jackson Square, the ceremonial heart of the city since its founding. The square is dominated by St. Louis Cathedral, the oldest Catholic cathedral in continuous use in the United States. The current structure dates primarily from 1850, though a church has occupied this site since 1727. Its 3 white steeples rise above the square like a spiritual beacon, flanked by the Cabildo on the left, where the final transfer of the Louisiana Purchase was signed in 1803, and the Presbytere on the right. In the center of the square, the equestrian statue of General Andrew Jackson commemorates his victory over the British in 1815. But by 1905, the square was no longer just a symbol of colonial or military power. It had become a place where street artists, vendors, and itinerant musicians gathered to make a living. This scene shows Canal Street, the most important commercial artery in the city. At over 170 feet wide, it was one of the broadest avenues in America. Electric streetcars run along their rails while horse-drawn carriages share the space with the first automobiles. On both sides, great department stores with names like Maison Blanche, D.H. Holmes, and Godshow's display the latest European fashions. Canal Street marked the traditional division between the French-speaking Creole world of the French Quarter and the English-speaking American sector that grew upriver after the Louisiana Purchase. Locals still called the median the neutral ground, a term dating from the days when the 2 cultures barely tolerated each other. Now I want to pause here for a moment, at Congo Square. This open space, located just north of the French Quarter in what is now Louis Armstrong Park, is perhaps the most important place in the history of American music. During the French and Spanish colonial period, enslaved people were permitted to gather here on Sundays. They came from all over the city and from surrounding plantations, bringing with them drums, improvised string instruments, and the musical traditions of their ancestral lands in West Africa. Visitors from other parts of the country were amazed at what they witnessed. Hundreds of people playing complex rhythms, dancing dances like the bambula and the kalinda, singing in languages whites could not understand. By 1905, the formal gatherings had ceased decades earlier, but the rhythms that were born here, the syncopation, the call and response, the polyrhythms, had penetrated the musical bloodstream of the city and were about to transform the world. This image shows Basin Street, the main entrance to Storyville, the legendary red light district that operated legally from 1897. Alderman Sidney Story drafted the ordinance that confined prostitution to this 38-block district, and to his eternal dismay, residents christened the place with his name. Storyville was not just a neighborhood of brothels, it was a complete ecosystem of saloons, gambling houses, restaurants, and above all, music halls. Establishments ranged from 50-cent shacks known as cribs to the elegant mansions on Basin Street, where wealthy clients paid up to $10 for a visit. In every one of these places, music was essential for attracting clientele. Musicians found constant work in Storyville, playing from dusk until dawn in an endless circuit of venues. A young Creole pianist named Ferdinand Lamoth, who would later adopt the name Jelly Roll Morton, began playing in Storyville brothels around 1902 when he was barely 12 years old. His middle-class family disowned him when they discovered where he worked. In these same saloons, cornetist Buddy Bolden was developing an entirely new style. He took ragtime, the popular music of the day, and played it in a raw, more improvised way, infusing it with the feeling of the blues and the spiritual songs from the Black Baptist churches of Uptown. Nobody called it jazz yet. That term wouldn't come into common use until a decade later. But what Bolden and his contemporaries were creating was unmistakably the sound that would conquer the 20th century. A few blocks from here, in a neighborhood known as the Battlefield, because of the violence that regularly occurred in its streets, Louis Armstrong was born in August of 1901. The poverty of his childhood is difficult to imagine. His father abandoned the family, his mother worked as a washerwoman and occasional prostitute, and young Louis spent his early years selling newspapers and coal to survive. He delivered coal to Storyville brothels, and it was there that he first heard the musicians who would change his life. In venues like Pete Lala's, where Joe King Oliver played, the child Armstrong absorbed every note he could. He had no way of knowing that one day he would be the most famous musician in the world, that his sound would define an era, that airports and parks would bear his name. This scene shows the port of New Orleans, where steamboats lined up along the waterfront like a floating city. By 1905, passenger traffic had already declined thanks to competition from the railroad, but steamers remained essential for commerce. They came down the Mississippi loaded with cotton, sugar, tobacco, and timber from the interior plantations. Steam whistles marked the hours of the day, announcing arrivals and departures, and music bands played on the decks to entertain passengers. Later, musicians like Louis Armstrong himself would find work on these boats, carrying the sound of New Orleans upriver toward Memphis, St. Louis, and Chicago. Here we see the Garden District, the neighborhood where the American elite built their mansions after the Louisiana Purchase. The French Creoles of the French Quarter looked down on these English-speaking newcomers, and the feeling was mutual. The Americans established their own world upriver, with Greek Revival and Victorian mansions surrounded by lush gardens. The houses were built on enormous lots, each one a monument to the wealth generated by the cotton trade. By 1905, the Garden District was already a living museum of pre-war Southern architecture, a reminder of an era of opulence built on the labor of enslaved people. This image captures something essential about daily life: a street vendor pushing his cart through the cobblestone streets. New Orleans was a city of street vendors, each with their own distinctive cry that residents could recognize from inside their homes. The coal man, the praline woman, the oyster seller, the knife sharpener, their voices were as much a part of the city's soundscape as the cathedral bells or the steamboat whistles. The smells also defined the experience: chicory coffee roasting in the cafes, gumbo simmering in Creole kitchens, beignets frying in hot oil, the acrid scent of the Mississippi when the wind blew from the east. Imagine for a moment walking through these streets on an afternoon in 1905. The humid heat of the subtropical summer envelops everything. From some nearby saloon comes the sound of a piano, playing a ragtime that occasionally slides into something freer, more improvised. On a corner, a group of street musicians plays for coins. Children run barefoot over the cobblestones. A Creole woman on her balcony watches the world go by while fanning the heavy air. Somewhere in this city, a cornetist named Buddy Bolden is slowly losing his mind, his sanity deteriorating until in 1907 he will be committed to a psychiatric hospital, never to play again. But the sound he helped create has already escaped, multiplying in dozens of other musicians, waiting for the moment when the world would be ready to hear it. The food of New Orleans tells its own story of cultural fusion. Gumbo, that thick stew that can contain almost any combination of meats and seafood, takes its name from the West African word ki ngombo, meaning okra. The roux technique comes from French cooking. Filet, the powdered sassafras leaves that sometimes thicken the broth, is a contribution from Native American peoples. Red beans and rice, traditionally served on Mondays, was the food of families who couldn't afford fresh meat every day. Chicory coffee, which locals still drink today at Café du Monde, became popular when pure coffee became too expensive during the Civil War, and residents learned to stretch their supplies by mixing them with roasted endive root. Before we move on to comparisons with the present, I want to reflect on what this particular moment in history means. 1905 was the peak of Buddy Bolden's band, the year Jelly Roll Morton began traveling the country carrying his music with him, the childhood of Louis Armstrong in the streets of the battlefield. No one in this city knew they were witnessing the birth of the most influential art form America would ever produce. To them, it was simply dance music, brothel entertainment, the background sound of a bustling port city. But the rhythms of Congo Square filtered through generations, mixed with ragtime and blues, performed by musicians who improvised because it was more interesting than repeating the same notes every night, were creating something that would change the way the world listens. Now I want to bring you into the present and show how these places look today. Thanks for being here, and if you have ideas or requests for future cities, share them in the comments. Let's get into it. The French Quarter maintains its basic structure, though the character of the neighborhood has changed profoundly. Bourbon Street, which in 1905 was a respectable residential area where Galatoire's restaurant had just opened its doors, has become the epicenter of party tourism. But just a few blocks away, the wrought iron balconies, shaded courtyards and painted shutters remain almost the same as over a century ago. Jackson Square remains the ceremonial heart of the city. St. Louis Cathedral suffered damage during Hurricane Katrina in 2005, when fierce winds uprooted trees in the back garden, but it has been restored. The street artists, tarot readers, and musicians who occupy the square today continue a tradition more than a century old. Canal Street has lost many of its great department stores, victims of changing consumer habits, but the streetcars have returned. The Canal Street line was eliminated in 1964, but restored in 2004, bringing back some of the turn-of-the-century atmosphere to the city's main artery. Congo Square now forms part of Louis Armstrong Park, named in honor of the city's most famous son. A historical marker indicates the importance of the site, and every Sunday, drum circles are still held that keep alive the tradition of the African musical gatherings that gave birth to jazz. Storyville no longer exists. The district was shut down in 1917 when the military pressured the city during World War I, concerned about the distractions it offered soldiers. Almost all the buildings were demolished in the following decades to build public housing. Today, very little physical evidence remains of the place where jazz was born, though the Storyville Museum in the French Quarter preserves the memory of that extraordinary period. The neighborhood where Louis Armstrong was born was razed in the 60s to build a courthouse and police headquarters complex. A plaque marks the spot where the humble house on Jane Alley once stood, but his legacy lives on in the international airport that bears his name, in the park with his statue, in the Satchmo Festival that celebrates his birthday every August, and above all, in the music that keeps playing on every corner of this city that never stopped being musical. I do really appreciate you watching. Your ideas, input and constructive feedback really do shape what comes next. Feel free to leave a comment below. Until next time.